Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 6 of this whispered read-through of the 70 Great Mysteries of the Ancient World, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. Check out the other parts if you haven't yet. This is a fascinating book that explores myths and legends throughout history and compares the archaeological and historic evidence for them. And we're up to number 26, the meaning of the megaliths. Quite an interesting topic actually, all of these ancient megalithic sites of huge stones organised in a ritualistic way. So 5000 BC onwards in Europe. A quote here from the Reverend Grover in 1847. I hardly know, sir, whether most would admire the grandeur and method of these vast remains, or the strangeness of their fate in being found here without a single chronicle or legend of their original structure or use. So these musings have been in place for centuries. The word megalith, from the Greek words for big and stone, means just that, a big stone. But we've got places such as Stonehenge, and megaliths can be used for building in any region and at any period. So those of special interests are those like the Cassia Hills in India, or Ethiopia and Madagascar. A Madagascan from an indigenous Malagasy people, knowledgeable about megaliths, who recently visited Stonehenge, actually gave a fluent account of its purpose, in which the key point is that the stones stand for the ancestors. A contemporary account which may capture or parallel its ancient meaning. I didn't know that there'd been people who descended from the megalithic way looking at Stonehenge. So we have indirect evidence, very occasionally surviving wood, to show that timber was used alongside stone in the same kind of engineering. So at some English sites, a timber setting was replaced by a stone one, making it clear that timber and earthen and megalithic arrangements could be equivalent, each in a variant suited to its building material. This is southern Brittany in France. They all stand here in great rows of alignments. This is a monolith standing in the village churchyard at Rudston in Yorkshire. So the best known megaliths of prehistory are those in ancient Europe. So this one in Rudston, the monolith, the largest in England, is 25.5 foot high. The largest in France is the Grand Menhir Brise, the Great Broken Menhir, which is about 280 tons. Now on the ground in 4 different pieces, but it would have stood 65.5 foot high if it was ever successfully erected. At Menec on the south coast of Brittany, as we saw in the previous picture, 11 rows stretch over 3,610 feet and include 1,099 granite megaliths. Special in the British Isles, of course, are the stone circles, where standing stones are placed to make neat circles or oval or egg-shaped rings, of which Stonehenge is the most famous example. Avebury, largest of the English stone circles, has more than 100 in a ring of around 1,300 foot across, and from it rambles a long avenue of paired stones. Examined with care, 2 stones were taken array, and the circles on them show subtle geometries in their plans. Their dimensions seem often to be multiples of a unit of length, a megalithic fathom or yard, but we're not sure if either the geometry of the unit was intended by the builders, so we may have invented it ourselves in search for some meaning or precision. The other common kind of European megalith is more of a building. Megalithic uprights supporting massive stones which then make a roof. So they create a chamber with a narrow passage, basically. Here's an image of an early modern idea of how they were built. By giants. So we have some small, regular people here in comparison to these giants walking around, putting these stone structures together. This is a 17th century Dutch print of one of the Netherlands, Hunebed, the old Dutch word for these structures. That would be rather fantastical, wouldn't it? They've been erected by giants. Newgrange in Ireland is aligned so that its chamber is directly illuminated by the sunrise on a midwinter's day, just like Stonehenge is aligned towards sunrise on a midsummer's day. Nuth, the grandest of the Irish megalithic sites, has two separate chambers with passages back to back, decorated stones inside each passage, and on the curbstones which mark the edge of the round mound. Here is a singular element in the great megalithic structure of the Boyne Valley in eastern Ireland. The art, intricate images here is lovely, isn't it? And here is a chamber, a gallery grave. Could have been covered in earth originally, actually, in France. So in folk knowledge, these megalithic creatures are often connected with giants, so there are both a giant's grave and giant's load in Ireland. The common type in Sardinia is the tumba dei giganti, the giant's grave. The old Dutch word for the Netherlandish type is hunebed, Hun's bed. So they often contain burials, so are quite often called chambered tombs, but sometimes they don't contain any bones. And of course the mound is enormous in relation to the quantity of human remains inside, and odd things are also done with the bones as well, so they might be sorted into different types, skulls together, long bones together, animals, bones found as well. The grandest at Bagno in northwest France stands in the courtyard of a local cafe, now 65.5 foot long by 23 foot wide, 10 foot high, which would make a suitable hall for a party. In our own culture, a church obviously contains burials, but its central purpose is not to be a grave, it's the focal point of a community with a defined territory, a parish. So in some regions where we think most or all of these tombs survive, they're directly spaced as one would expect, where each farm or hamlet community mark its own land with a megalith. These European ones mostly date to the Neolithic era of the first farmers, 5000 BC or before onwards. So many of their ritual monuments, like the megaliths, are singular in form and enigmatic in purpose. Singular circular enclosures with ditches that don't look to have had a military or defensive point. Ditches that wander across a landscape for kilometres, settings of split oak posts. If we see them in modern Western attitudes, you can imagine farmers clearing the woodland to make the fields and settling down to live in one place instead of constantly moving around like hunter-gatherers had. And by degrees they would have built up Neolithic savings, a bit of surplus, time to spend the effort and energy to build a megalith. But some of these date earlier. They're not optional luxuries. They're added to after the hard early years where they can be afforded. A functional purpose of burial isn't the whole story. And the tombs also suggest that bodies weren't disposed of, put away once and for all at a funeral. There's evidence of a two-stage ritual. The body was exposed, perhaps on a wooden platform. Then the remaining and larger bones from the smaller ones, and like fingers and toes, were likely lost with the flesh, but would be put inside the megalithic chamber. The remains were actively used, so older burials were pushed to one side while those of a newer body took their place. So we now conceive of Neolithic communities as much concerned with their own pasts, societies in which the dead had an active life and their ancestors were central to social identity. So if the megalithic chambers are tombs, they are in a sense tombs for the living. This is Avebury, the greatest of the English stone circles, a complex structure that's much inferred within medieval times. They stand in the great circle round its edge, and in other groupings inside, which were recovered from burial pits by 20th century archaeologists. What a stunning vista there. So the megaliths are enjoying a lot of contemporary interest, of course, at sites like West Kennet, a chambered tomb near the Great Rings and avenues of Avebury. One today finds burning incense, sticks and offerings of flowers and bread. So they're seen as sacred sites where the natural forces of the earth and of appropriate human reference are rightly expressed. And to archaeologists, these new ideas don't seem to capture or express the specifics of ancient meanings as we can infer them, but it is right and fitting that these old sites are active places, once more, finding a social expression. Mother Goddess cult. 7000 to 2000 BC, Anatolia, Europe and the Mediterranean. The goddess is nature and earth itself, pulsating with seasons, bringing life in spring and death in winter. So in these gender-aware days when male representations of the Christian god are increasingly called into question, the argument for a prehistoric mother goddess cult has gained many adherents. The idea goes back to the 19th century. So theories that the original human society was matriarchal, and the patriarchy, which has been dominant in recent times, actually developed at a later stage. So adherents of this hypothesis claim support from the analysis of myths from the ancient Near East and Aegean. Anthropologists sought to distinguish an early universal religion in which the dominant figure, a great goddess, was attended by a dying god whose birth and demise symbolized the annual seasonal cycle. The most compelling statement of this belief was found in Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough, a massive and wide-ranging comparative study of myth and religion throughout the world that was published in 12 volumes between 1911 and 1915. So such was the general background that led the English archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans so readily to subscribe to the theory that the Minoan religion of Crete was centered on the cult of a great goddess, a female figure depicted in frescoes and figurines at Knossos. So too a Malta, Themistocles, Samet saw in the imagery from Tarshan and House of Flini the evidence of a prehistoric goddess religion, and this was soon extended to the sketchy or enigmatic representations of the Neolithic tombs of northwest Europe. Here is a mother goddess figurine from Turkey, 7th century millennium. Research shows that figurines here weren't placed in shrines within the settlement as previously thought, but they were deposited in courtyards and open areas. There is nothing to suggest that these represented deities, though they may be connected in some way with death. This is a sculpture of a sleeping female figure from Tarshan, Malta, 3rd millennium BC, which helped give rise to a prehistoric goddess religion theory. And here we have the Phaeons figurine from the Minoan palace at Knossos in Crete, 2nd millennium BC, depicting a bare-breasted female grasping a small snake in each hand. So snakes are associated with the divine in early Aegean mythology, but whether this figure represents a goddess or an attendant engaged in some ritual practice remains in doubt. This here is a colossal the base of a colossal limestone statue from the base of a prehistoric temple of Tarshan in Malta. It's lacking a upper part, so it could have represented a leading male member, or as a corpulent mother goddess. And here is the womb-like character of the passage graves of Western Europe. Like this example from Brittany in France, it was held by Marija Gimbutas as further support for a matriarchal interpretation of early European society. So she argued, Maria Gimbutas, that with a series of books, used Neolithic figurines of southeast Europe to develop a model of peaceful early farming societies that venerated goddesses and were organised matriarchally. So this social order extended from the Near East to Western Europe, where it was revealed not through figurines but in the spiritual motifs of megalithic art, in the womb-like character of Neolithic passage graves, and in the circular plan of major ritual monuments. She argued that the plan of major ritual monuments Gimbutas argued that these goddess-worshipping matriarchies were eventually supplanted by warlike patriarchies in a series of invasions by horse-riding peoples from the Eurasian steppes in the 4th and 3rd millennia. So archaeologists are ready to accept that the notion that prehistoric societies were probably very different from those of the recent past, but the main objection to Gimbutas' theory is that her analysis ignores the diversity and context of the evidence. Anthropomorphic representations of female gender are found widely in prehistoric and early historic sites. The figure with collar and breasts carved in the outline of the wall of the Courtyard Hypogeum in northwestern France, and the snake goddess from the palace of Knossos on Crete that we saw on the previous page are two of the examples. But male images and symbols such as phalluses are also common, and in the same societies where the female figures are found. And there's no reason to assume that all such representations are divine. They may have easily just represented ancestors or the recently deceased. Images of the dead kept in the household, perhaps until the period of mourning was completed. The likelihood is that there are a number of different explanations, but whether in terms of religious belief or social organisation, very doubtful. To understand that there could be a single overarching explanation, but one striking fact about the evidence mustered by Gimbutas is its very diversity, and there is also one of its greatest weaknesses: figurines in houses, in graves and in temples, as well as spiral carvings on megalithic tombs as seen here in Ireland. A careful study of each of these cases suggests not a single universal religion, but a wide variety of diverse beliefs and practices. And finally, the hypothesis that early prehistoric Europe was a peaceful matriarchal society until warfare, violence, and the destructive ethos of competition introduced by invasions of patriarchal horse riders on the steppes can be challenged at almost every point. Old Europe wasn't peaceful. The butchered individuals, men, women and children, dispatched by an axe blow to the head at Thalheim in Germany, would certainly not have thought so, nor are invasions from the steppes supported by archaeological evidence. There is nothing to show new people sweeping across Europe in the fourth or third millennia. Actually, quite the contrary, everything points to the steady in situ development of indigenous societies. So this mother goddess and this hypothesis and others must accordingly be rejected in the light of current archaeological understanding. It provides an object lesson in the imposition of wishful thinking on the archaeological record. That, however, is not to reject the belief that women and female deities may have played very different roles in human societies of the past, and to reject the idea of a widespread prehistoric matriarchy is not to suggest that patriarchy is the natural or necessarily the desirable condition of human society. I agree with that. The famous Iceman, were they a shepherd or a shaman, around 3,300 to 3,200 years BC, Italian Alps. A report in 1994, a police report in Conrad Spindler. Alpine incident, body recovered at Hauslobrück. The dead man's identity has not yet been established. On the strength of the articles found near the body, it may be assumed that the accident happened as long ago as the 19th century. And as we discovered, this was a long time before that. So on the 19th of September 1991, two German mountaineers discovered the oldest preserved human body ever recorded in modern times. This was in the Italian South Tyrol, close to the main ridge of the Alps, and only 90 metres away from the international frontier with Austria. So this section of the Alps is known as the Otztaler Alps, taking its name from the Ostal Valley, and the body is commonly known today by the nickname Otzi, coined by an Austrian journalist through conflation of Otzal and Yeti, but many simply refer to the body as the Iceman. The desolate and remote setting of the discovery has led to numerous hypotheses as to how the Iceman met their end. Scientific evidence yielded a considerable amount of detail about the state of health and about the equipment which they carried and was found around the body in the narrow gully. So the body proved to be that of a man, aged somewhere between 25 and 45 years old. The excellent state of preservation means that even the molecular structure of the tissues had survived. And the reason for this degree of preservation lay in the sequence of events that led to and followed the death of the Iceman. It's thought that the man died after being overcome by an early autumn blizzard. The thin covering of snow prevented attack from insect larvae, as the corpse was gradually desiccated by autumn winds, and in essence what occurred was a natural freeze-drying. The condition of the corpse was already largely stabilised when the heavy winter snows came to cover it. Radiocarbon dating of tissues from the body, undertaken separately in 4 different laboratories of greater reliability, indicated that these events took place between 3,300 and 3,200 BC. So the corpse must have lain buried for over 5,000 years before the melting of the ice. These were the first initial attempts to free the body, and it only got as far as the hips. And only when the corpse had been removed to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Innsbruck did its true age and significance become clear. Here is a reconstruction of the clothing and equipment that they would have had: reeds or straw, capes, and this unfinished bow and stave, arrow shafts and leather quiver from the Iceman's equipment. If he was intending to hunt, he wasn't very well prepared. So the preservation of the Iceman is more remarkable than mysterious, but the circumstances of the death and the significance of the objects he was carrying do indeed pose many questions. So there was a copper axe, hafted in a U-handle, an unfinished bow, also of yew, a backpack made of large planks and animal hide, a flint knife and a scabbard, a deerskin quiver with 2 flint-tipped arrows and 12 unfinished arrow shafts, a calfskin pouch which hung from a belt. In addition to that, the remains from the clothing also survived: fur leggings and a cap, fur outer garment of poncho type, leather shoes stuffed with grass for warmth, a grass cape that could have doubled as a ground sheet or blanket. So despite the absence of warm, modern, waterproof materials, the set of clothing was well able to cope with the harsh climate, at least outside of winter months. There's a polished marble bead and the attached leather tassels that were claimed to indicate that the Iceman was a shaman. And here's the body laid out with some of its equipment over here. The copper axe lashed to its wooden haft found close to the body gave one of the first indications of its state. And here is an international team of specialists undertaking detailed examination of the Iceman to determine the age, state of health, and evidence for cause of death. So the Iceman wasn't in the peak of health. Analysis of one of his fingernails revealed that he'd suffered from serious illnesses, resulting in interruptions to their growth, and at least 3 times during the 6 months before they died, they suffered with interruptions to growth. There were tattoos on the lower back, left leg and right ankle and knee, which could have been decorative but probably had a therapeutic function, since the Iceman suffered from arthritis. Analysis of the colon contents was indicating that he was afflicted by an intestinal infestation that could have caused chronic diarrhea, but most serious of all was the direct evidence that 8 of his ribs had been fractured not long previously. They'd begun to mend, but the evidence here shows that they may have been involved in some violence that had driven them from the village, and that's when he was fleeing across the Alps with unfinished equipment that the winter overcame them. Oh dear, they had a very, very tough time of it near the end, didn't they? All through their lives, it sounds like. So other explanations or interpretations are possible. One such is that they were simply a shepherd. So the analysis of the moss from the body showed that it had come from the south side of the Alps, and it's quite possible that the home of the Iceman was in the Vinchgau, only some 20 kilometres, 12.5 miles due south of the place where he met his end. Pollen suggests that his death occurred in the early autumn, making him perhaps a victim of misadventure, shepherding the flock in upland pastures in a none too good state of health, and then an unseasonable wintry storm overwhelmed him. Not all have been content with these prosaic explanations, though, and some have argued that the Iceman was in fact a shaman or ritualistic specialist. These unfinished pieces of equipment, the tattoos, the perforated bead of white marble with twisted leather tassels, they've all been seen as supporting this theory. So shamans commune with the spirit world, often in remote locations, which might explain their journey to the high mountains, and ethnographic examples indicate that the bright or polished stones are often held to have had special significance or power, though quartz rather than marble is the more usual material. But the evidence that the Iceman was a shaman could not be overwhelming, though its possibility difficult to discount. The unique nature of the discovery, the exceptional conditions of preservation, give us little with which to compare him. If more evidence were available, we might be less inclined to attribute to the Iceman some ritual or religious status, and more willing, notwithstanding the curious features of his equipment, to regard him as a typical member of a high alpine community of the 4th millennium BC, distinguished more by the fate that befell him and his body than his status in life. How did they build Stonehenge? That is a question that a lot of people ask. 2 2950 to 1600 BC in southern England. Here's Edward Aldrich, a voiceless vision of a vanished age. These solemn triliths of a temple stand on the unquestioning plain, a hoary band and mystery of every modern sage. So how did they build it? The pat answer would be with difficulty, and the true answer is probably with less difficulty than we'd think. Other circles in Britain, of which there are 100, some of them of a much larger diameter, of stones left in their natural state, and only at Stonehenge are these great stones neatly trimmed into squared-off shapes. The horizontal stones that span the gaps between the uprights like the lintel across a doorway are held in place by mortice and tenon joints as if they were beams of timber, and adjacent horizontal stones are held tight against each other by tongue and groove joints. Again, a timber working technique, so we've known these facts in the beginning. Our earliest record of Stonehenge, as early as the 11th century, talks of the place as being built like doorways. So here it is today, missing some stones. It was perhaps never even completed to the full intended plan. And here are usually how most wooden monuments from the age of Stonehenge have rotted away completely, leaving only their traces. There's dark marks in the soil. This is a rare exception, the strange monument on the Norfolk coast, christened Stonehenge. So Stonehenge built of stones constructed as if it were made of wood. And then within a few kilometres of Stonehenge, pioneering air photographers spotted from the air a set of marks in the grass, altogether much the same size as Stonehenge and organised in the same way into concentric settings. The site was evidently something like it, Stonehenge, but made of timber, so it was named Woodhenge. It even has an axis orientated towards the midsummer sunrise like Stonehenge. So in 1998 to 99, for the first time, one of these timber monuments was recovered intact, rather than as marks in the earth. Here on the coastal mud just off the Norfolk coast of East England, and dated by tree ring dating to precisely 2050 BC, it was immediately named Seahenge. In the centre of a ring of wooden posts, a single great oak tree stood, set vertically into the ground. So what at first looked like the branches were in fact roots. The tree had been put in upside down. It's fascinating. So the builders of Stonehenge had traditional craft knowledge, not just of transporting great stones and setting them upright, but also of moving great tree stumps, and as we can see in the other traces of timber work, of splitting massive oak logs into slabs. So it was these skills that made Stonehenge possible. We don't know what these wooden structures were like above ground. They might have been buildings with roofs or simple standing timbers carved like in Native American totem poles. Seahenge, our first material site of the above-ground component, has surprised us in being different again, rather than just resembling Stonehenge. Stonehenge is our close analogy. It's reasonable to think that the timber structures looked like Stonehenge. Instructively, other stones at Stonehenge, originally 8 in number, which are more overlooked than the famous settings at the heart of the monument and dated rather earlier, were not trimmed on the model of woodworking. So the first requirement in building Stonehenge would have been obtaining the right kind of stones, and of the several types used, the most numerous are blue stones, which were brought from West Wales, around 150 miles away. So they're typically about the dimensions of a coffin. They weigh up to 4 tons, so it wouldn't have been so hard to drag them overland or to float them on skin coracles along the coast and up one of the English rivers close to Stonehenge, but it wouldn't have been that easy either. So in 2000, with a modern reenactment, a Welsh bluestone was dragged towards Stonehenge, mounted on a sled. They struggled to find enough volunteers to pull it, and then once on boats, the stone slipped into the water and was lost. It had to be fished up off the bottom of the sea so that the trial could continue. And that's with, 2000 knowledge and methodology and physiology. So the larger sarsen stones at Stonehenge are much heavier, but they come from closer to hand, 18 miles away. So the main difficulty would have been finding enough sarsens of sufficient size. It's built to its full design. It would have needed 79 of them. And the older megalithic circles and avenues at Avebury would have already used up several hundred. Many of the sarsens at Stonehenge have very little of their length underground for foundation support, and it doesn't seem to have been run out of stones. So moving these sartans, which weigh up to 40 tons and more, was the first task. So experiments with a replica stone in 1994 by the archaeologist Julian Richards and engineer Mark Whitby gave us confidence to say how it might have done. Could have been levered onto a timber cradle and pulled by teams with ropes. It's usually thought that the cradle would have run over rollers, but the engineer in the 94 tests found a better way, sliding the cradle on timber rails, plentifully greased. Their stone struck until rocked free and then went well, with a team of 130 volunteers pulling. Of course, modern ropes were used for safety's sakes, but it's known that good ropes of sufficient strength could have been made in prehistoric times from the inner barks of trees. So it was estimated that that could have been pulled a full kilometre in a day on a modest uphill slope at a full 6.5 miles on the level or downhill. So we know that Neolithic people were skilled in splitting oak trees to make the rails, and between the Marlborough Downs, where the sartans are found, and Stonehenge is the Vale of Pusey, they would have had to have been taken down the steep scarp of the valley's north wall, across the down valley and up the slope onto the high downland where Stonehenge was built. The stones can be shaped by hammering with the same stone, which is a slow business since it's very hard and doesn't break off in large pieces, but it is worn away grain by grain. So many mauls and hammerstones of varied size have been found at Stonehenge, but they were later used to hold upright steady in where they were later in their foundations. Raising them was also tested by that experiment in 94. It was tipped up into a prepared hole and ingeniously made to topple well by sliding a smaller stone across it, abruptly changing its balance. Neolithic technology could have done that, but would the mines have had the same idea? The stone was then pulled upright by ropes running over a timber A-frame by a team of about 130 labourers, men and women of varying ages and strength. And the final task was, once the uprights were wedged securely in their holes, was to raise the lintel stones onto the top. That could have been done either by pulling the stone up on a sloping ramp or levering it up first on one side, then onto the other on a rising scaffold or stacked logs, whichever method was used. Once raised to the required height, the lintels had to be trimmed into shape and moved into their final position, and since no trace of any ramps have been found, it seems that the method of using stacked logs is more likely. So given the labour force of 130 or more, and with the skills in moving stones and shaping timbers that we know that the Neolithic people possess, perhaps building Stonehenge wasn't so hard as it seems to us. We're accustomed to machinery that can replace us, which then I suppose creates a sense of, well, how did they build Stonehenge without that? It's a curious footnote to the fragment of Stonehenge built in the experimental test. It wasn't intended to be left. It looks superb in its North Wiltshire field, and the notion took hold to let it remain as a modern curiosity. It was then taken down when rumour had it that an unofficial rave or festival would take place there. But rumour now has it that the component stones are in store, available to anyone who wants to have a go at building their own Stonehenge, the ancient or the modern way. In the raising of a Stonehenge lintel, modern engineers use manpower, but also scaffold and safety helmets, which of course the Neolithic people would not have had. Huge stones. I wonder how many accidents happened. Where did the Indo-Europeans come from? James Parsons in 1767. My leisure hours for some time past have been employed in considering the striking affinity of the languages of Europe and finding every day new and most engaging entertainment in this pursuit. I was insensibly led on to attempt following them to their source. So 7,000 to 3,000 BC in Eurasia. So although Europe and Western Asia have seen many cultures and peoples, most Europeans and a significant part of Western and Southern Asians have spoken related languages belonging to a single language family that began to expand across Eurasia sometime during the Neolithic or Early Bronze Age. So the similarities between these words is explained by deriving them all from a common ancestral language, like we derive French, Spanish or Italian from late Latin, known as Indo-European. So the correspondences between the items of vocabulary in the different Indo-European language assists linguists in reconstructing the general shape and at least some of the content of Proto-Indo-European. It reveals the names of trees such as birch, oak, willow, ash, wild animals, this suggests that the proto-language did not dissolve until its speakers at least shared a common Neolithic vocabulary, the period when these innovations appeared. So many have attempted to use the evidence of the proto-language, particularly reconstructed words for environmental terms, to locate where it was spoken. Here's a silver-gilt Thracian plaque from Letnitz showing a sacred marriage. So unfortunately there seems to be a general rule that the more diagnostic or distinctive the meaning of the reconstructed word, the less secure it is in its reconstruction, so the use of the vocabulary alone to locate the earliest Indo-Europeans has never led to convincing results. Why do we need to look for them in a confined location? So the problem's both empirical and theoretical. So we know that there were non-Indo-European languages spoken in some of the margins of Europe, such as Iberia in Spain, Etruscan in Italy, Attic in Anatolia. We know that some Indo-Europeans spread over earlier non-Indo-European speaking populations. So the Iranians assimilated the Elamites of southern Iran. The Indo-Aryans had to spread their language over earlier Dravidian and Munda speakers. And furthermore, one non-Indo-European language has survived in Europe, Basque, which is spoken in northern Spain and southern France. So the theoretical problem concerns the entire nature of language change. To position the Indo-Europeans from the Atlantic to western China, since deepest antiquity greatly exceeds the size of area which any single language would have maintained in the prehistoric period. Languages are constantly evolving. It would be impossible to imagine how the speakers of a single language spread across several thousand kilometers could maintain the same language changes for thousands of years. So the proposed locations of the Indo-European homeland, or Heimat as a German might put it, have ranged from the north to the south pole, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Basically there are three types of models for the origin currently under discussion. The first suggests that the Proto-Indo, may be found before the Neolithic during either the Paleolithic or Mesolithic in some broad expanse across Eurasia. So by pushing their origins back so far and over such a broad area, most of Europe, this reduces the demand on the archaeologists to demonstrate later long-distance migrations to account for the dispersal of the Indo-European languages. It's the least acceptable model because it doesn't account for the shared Neolithic, indeed late Neolithic vocabulary that we find in the reconstructed proto-language. The second model is the spread of agriculture, a model which has also been used to extend to other language families. Spread with a new, far more productive economy, that the new Indo-European speaking farmers gradually filled up Europe to replace earlier hunter-gathering populations. Some have argued that the expansion was entirely demic. It involved largely a population replacement, while others suggested that the periphery of Europe did not see an influx of new farmers, but rather underwent language shifts. As with the major Indo-European languages of Asia, they generally follow the third hypothesis. The third model requires major language shift amongst most of the Neolithic Bronze Age populations of Europe and Western Asia. The theory genuinely situates the earliest Indo-Europeans in the steppe and forest steppe north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Argues that the earliest Indo-European expansions were accomplished by semi-nomadic or at least highly mobile populations who possessed the domestic horse and wheeled vehicles. They typically buried their dead under a mound. Russian Kurgan is often termed the Kurgan theory. Argues that from the 5th to the 3rd millennia, mobile populations began moving off the steppe into the southeastern and central Europe areas and progressively assimilated the native populations to their own Indo-European language. So this model does not depend as much on population movement as a social shift. The language is spread because of the nature of early Indo-European social institutions, which were more aggressive and attractive than those previously found in Europe. And as for the Indo-Europeans of Asia, the Kurgan model suggests that by 2000 BC, chariot-driving aristocracies had developed in the Volga-Ural region, and had then crossed eastward and south through Central Asia to form Bronze Age elites in Greater Iran and India. Although there's not a wholly acceptable model to explain Indo-European origins and expansions, the problem itself continually stimulates scholars to consider how language, one of the most intrinsic elements of human culture, can be tracked in the archaeological record. It's interesting, isn't it, how archaeology can influence language and how we geographic changes to understand linguistic ones. Thank you for joining me for this